Hello and welcome to this video on Dail, a highly flexible and unique feature-ridden quantizer from Instruo. You can also use this video for tips and tricks on using quantizers, slew, transposition and precision adders. Here's what's to come. This video is sponsored by Instruo. Quantizers are something that I love in modular synths as it allows us to create melodies and tuned musical notes out of pretty much any signal you'll find in a modular system. Dail is a 4HP quantizer that doesn't just have a flexible feature set, but has additional things that would take multiple extra modules to implement, as well as something that I think is a world first. And starting with that world first thing, and please tell me if you've seen this elsewhere as I haven't seen this before, Dail can actually quantize to different notes in different octaves. Rather than having a single octave of notes that you select and quantize to, the notes that it quantizes to can be different in different octaves. This is really nice for musical spread chord voicings that span a couple of octaves or so. There's also an equal distribution mode that spreads the available selected notes to quantize to across the voltage range for smoother and more rhythmically stable note generation. The interface has smart gesture-based features. There's also the option with the included expander to select the notes to quantize to via MIDI. There's also a built-in precision adder with selectable notes, again using this multi-octave feature, for onboard higher or lower pitch transpositions, octave jumps and more. And there's also an analog input that is a precision adder input, which will merge that signal with the quantizer's output. And finally, there's also a slew, which will add a pitch slide and glide after the quantizer. So running down the panel here, we have our CV input, which will be quantized, and there's a second CV input which will merge with the quantizer's output, working as a precision adder. There's a trigger output, which fires for every new note that's quantized, and we have a clock input, which you can use to trigger like a sample and hold to choose when it samples and quantizes a new note. We have a gate output, which is exclusively for sustained MIDI gates. And then we have two buttons and a slider and switch as the interface for working with the module. There's an included 2HP expander that has a USB-A host port for MIDI control, and it can also power MIDI controllers. And there's also a TRS MIDI input with a switch on the back for A or B style TRS MIDI inputs. For a longer video manual style rundown of the features, there's a comprehensive video on the Instruo YouTube channel that I'll link below, as well as the PDF manual. All the patches are on screen, and they're linked down below so you can skip around. I'll go through how Dail works with each patch. So let's dive in. So let's start here with some kind of quantizing basics and looking at Dail. I have the octone here, and that's doing some unquantized sequencing. That comes into the CV input. Dail is quantizing it and coming out to control the pitch of my oscillator. That sound is going into a VCA. It's manic here with some clipping as well. And that VCA is controlled by an envelope, which is struck by the trigger output there. So every new note will fire off a trigger an envelope just off screen, and open up the VCA. Now if we go into the programming mode, which is pushing this switch to the left, the bottom button will enable notes for the quantizing, and the top button will enable them for precision adding. We're only going to quantize in this patch, and you can simply fill or clear by pressing and holding and moving the slider. So nothing is active here. And as I go back into the mid position, this will enable these settings. which is no currently active notes. If I wanted to fill this, I'd go back into programming mode, press to enable and hold, slide all the way up, which is going to enable all the notes chromatically here. I'd actually prefer, say, a chord tone, so I'll press and hold, clear this time, and go through one by one, and let's say do a C minor, C, E flat, and G, or maybe add that B flat, that minor 7 on top, and then enable this by going into the mid switch position. But as well as either individually selecting notes or just filling or clearing all chromatic notes, there are some preset scales. So I'll go back into program mode, and again this is decoupled from the actual quantizing. It doesn't change settings until you go back into that center position. I'll just go through and disable these notes just so it's visually clear. You don't have to do this. And holding quantizer, I'm going to push up, down and up again, and this is a kind of gesture based control. You can now see, and I'm keeping hold of this button, a basic major triad. Going down and up goes to the next scale, C major pentatonic, C major 7, C Ionian full major scale, and a variety of other major scales. There's a whole tone scale in there, and you just wrap back round to that major. Let's go C major 7, enable that. And you can also do minor scales, so back to the program mode here. I'm going to start at the top this time and go down, up, down, up. Starts with a minor triad, minor 7, minor pentatonic, and a variety of minor scales. There's more minor than major. I'll put a list of them on screen. Let's stick with that. But there's a much easier way to actually do this. If I go to programming mode and use the expander, which is just USB in this case, and the keyboard that I'll overlay on screen, you might be able to see me waving in the corner, and actually just press and hold down MIDI notes to choose a selection. And you can see I can then enable these notes. Let's enable more of a chord tone. You can see these changing. And I actually think that's a really powerful and performable way to use the module, which is to use MIDI, and I know many of you watching won't want to play a keyboard, but to just use it as simple note input. You can go across the program there. It's really easy to just input your note data. Something I love to do with quantizers is to make melodies from modulation. The yellow trace here is a simple triangle LFO from Oct. The red trace, red cables, is me using an oscillator as a clock to externally clock Dail. And I'm quantizing to this clock, and the green trace is the output that's controlling my oscillator in this patch. Now if I clock this faster, we'll get something much closer to the triangle wave input. If I sample much slower than each cycle of this triangle wave, we're undersampling and pulling what feels more like a random melody than a more obvious triangle-like shape at the input to the quantizer. And one really important thing here to note is that with any analog source that I'm quantizing, not just with Dail, whether that's sequencing like the Octone or LFOs, I attenuate my input to a quantizer first. I first have the LFO coming up into a utility here up in my 1U row, and the level of this triangle, which you'll see on this yellow trace, defines how much voltage range we're going to move through the quantizer. This is set to a major scale, and as I increase the level, we're going through more octaves. So dialing in the amount of signal before you hit the quantizer,
Playing with the rate of quantizing with an external clock, we have a really simple but really powerful, and I think musically compelling way to make melodies. We can hear this triangle shape moving through an amount of pitch range and amount of octaves set by my attenuator, and by choosing a rate that complements, we're following this triangle pattern, but there's variety in it because these two sources are synced, they're not clocked. And that's one of the beauties of doing things in a free-running manner. So here I want to look at kind of performatively playing the note selection as a musical performance kind of technique. I have a beat in the background. I'll mute that for now, just from my sequencing. And here's my bass line. And let's just take my sequence straight into my oscillator here. The green trace and green cable is an already quantized sequence from the Eloquencer. There's probability in there and some changes in rhythm. I'm using that rhythm to clock the quantizer and to trigger envelopes here in the patch. But what we're going to do is go into note selection and actually play with selecting notes against the beat as a performative feature. So I'm down to just one note here. Let's bring my beat back in. And I'm going to build up from a note to a root and fifth, root third and fifth, and to the full scale tone to build out this sequence while I mute my beats, add some performance controls. So bringing in the kick, changing my kind of macro performance control, and bringing in another interval into this riff. Let's do this again, but this time going to programming mode and add that third. Bringing in another note. Let's do it again with the full sequence here. It's a bit of a handful trying to do multiple mutes on the drums and the scale changes and my performance control. But I always like playing with quantizers and playing with the note selection. It's how I might produce a track in a DAW, starting it on one note, then kind of root third fifth or just root and fifth, building out to a fuller scale, more melodic information as the track progresses. So one thing I really love to do with quantizers is to use them to create bass lines, counter melodies and variations on a single sequence without needing a second sequence. Now outside of Dail here, there's some effects in the background, but I have one oscillator playing into a VCA playing my main sequence. The main sequence is this green trace and these green cables, a split of that goes to the volt per octave, and that's also the input to the quantizer, which plays my second voice, which is a TSL, again into another VCA channel with its own envelope. This envelope, rather than being controlled by my main sequence, is from the trigger out here. I'm triggering Dail, set to the same quantized scale as my actual sequence, to create variations. And one simple thing is to use that clock and the idea of sample and hold over a quantizer to just create a rhythmic variation. This is the main rhythm both voices are playing. If I take out some notes, just have a less busy sequence, and putting that against the main one, I could say go up an octave, add some slew, it's a nice counter melody all based on that single sequence. We could go the other way and go down an octave. Kind of an auto bassline in this case. So less of a rhythmic figure. I've taken some notes out of the rhythm, triggering the quantizer and my envelope. Same sequence, varied in Dail, to give me a counter melody, a bassline or a variation on a single sequence. So here's another really fun and kind of simple but really musical ways to use a quantizer. I have a basic 5-step repeating arpeggio pattern, that's the blue trace here and the input to Dail, but I'm using the clock input like a sample and hold here, and the green trace here and green cables is my rhythm sequence. I'll overlay my sequencer in the video edit as well so you can see the active steps. And this is kind of carving into this 5-step arpeggio and pulling out an evolving sequence. Now there's some drums in the background. Let's mute those for now. And if I enable all steps on my sequencer here, we can hear this basic 5-step sequence. Just an oscillator into a VCA, trigger out controls the envelope for the VCA, and it's the same trigger coming in here to choose when to quantize. And if I just say do a trigger every 4 steps, because the input is a 5-step sequence, this evolves over time. If I make something more rhythmically interesting, I have a 16-step sequence to generate my trigger rhythm, again green trace and green cables, but a 5-step input signal. Doing this over the beat, I can play with how busy and dense this pattern is. You could use Euclidean rhythm generators, probability-based sequencing, ratchets, different rhythms, anything you like into that clock input to really rhythmically carve into repeating patterns to create something evolving and performative. So although I've been adding Slew to bits of sequencing and quantizing here already, I just wanted to make a short patch just to explain it. In that central switch position, the slider adds a slew, and it adds a slew to the rising pitches that are going up, and to the falling edges, pitches that are going down. It has a logarithmic rising shape, and an exponential, haven't quite got my exponential log hand moves down there, but an exponential falling shape. And hopefully you can see on this green trace, green cable here, it has that kind of classic ADSR-like shape. And one thing to note, the octave shifts that happen in that central switch position don't go through the slew, so you can still quickly jump up and down octaves. So a bit of slew there. I'll play the octaves and I'll play an external keyboard off screen, which is going into the expander, which is just on the edge of my case, to change the available note selection. So here's something that I think is a world first. I certainly haven't seen it anywhere else. Let me know in the comments if you have. And it's the fact that with Dail you can do a multi-octave quantizing. You don't have to have the same note selection in each octave of quantizing behaviour. Now here's a droning sound into lots of effects. The pitch is controlled by Dail's output. I have a C minor 7, C, E flat, G and B flat just set as normal, and a voltage offset here on Manic into the quantizer to control the pitch. As I slide the slider here, we get the same notes in every octave, very standard quantizer behaviour. Now to do the multi-octave stuff, let's go into the program mode, let's take out E flat and B flat, we'll stick with C and G in this octave, and we use a gesture like a double tap gesture, pushing the fader up twice to move to the next octave. This now flashes once, or continuously without a gap, so once repetitively if you like, to show we're in the octave above. If I double tap again, you get 2 flashes to show you're in the second octave, and again we'll get 3, 1, 2, 3, rest, and so on. And if you double tap to go down, we can see we're in octave 2, back to octave 1 above, and back to our root. We'll do a 2-octave spanning pattern here, so I'll double tap up once, and I'll add the E flat and the B flat, and in the octave below we still have the C and the G. As I go to play now, this is all on the single keyboard interface, but watch how we jump past E flat to G into the next octave. We don't have a C, we have the E flat, and then a B flat, not the G. And this will keep going: C, G, E flat, B flat, C, G again. Now let's actually do a 3-octave pattern rather than just 2. So in my bottom octave I have C and G, double tap E flat, B flat, let's double tap again, and this time we'll add a D and an F. So D and F in the top octave, E flat, B flat, and C and G. Back into play mode, we can see all active notes, but again watch how we get C then G, E flat, B flat, D then F. Let's do this with MIDI input, because it's much simpler with MIDI input than going in, but I do think this double tap feature is a smart way of going in through these octaves and doing this unique multi-octave quantization. It's something I've never seen before. So here we'll take a look at using MIDI to really quickly and efficiently do multi-octave scale programming, but first I wanted to look at the 2 different distributions, as this is another unique feature that I've not seen anywhere else. If I hold the bottom button here, this will flash under my finger. It's probably a bit hard to see in these studio lights. And then you press the top button to change distribution. Now if you've ever sent a ramp, which is what this green trace input is to Dail here, if you've ever sent a ramp into a quantiser, you've probably had these kind of wonky rhythmic patterns. And it's doing this, and I'll put some graphics on screen, because there's a kind of tighter cluster of notes that pass quickly, then a gap, then a slight gap, then a slight gap. We don't have evenly distributed notes across this whole range. However, if we hold this button again, get that flashing and press for even distribution, Dail will intelligently and evenly spread the range of the notes, meaning from a ramp, we get a steady input. If we change the amount of notes here, say just a C and an E flat, if this was normal distribution, again hold the bottom button, tap the top one, passes these quickly, then nothing, passes them quickly in the next octave, and nothing, leading to this broken rhythm. But the even distribution spreads these out. If we go 3 notes, it's just working out how to evenly spread these as I input new notes. And my new note input's coming from MIDI via USB on the expander. So now we're in even distribution mode, which is much nicer to listen to for ramped arpeggios from an LFO. Let's look at multi-octave programming via MIDI. If we take, say, a C minor 9 voicing, which would be C, E flat for the minor 3rd, G for the 5th, B flat for a minor 7, and D. On a normal quantiser, the higher notes would all collapse into a single octave, and you'd have a pattern like this, where it plays C, D, E flat, G, B flat, rather than having that D in the octave above. If I just play that D an octave above, so I have a 2-octave pattern here, or if I do spread voicings, where I say have root and fifth, C and G, and then E flat, B flat, and even D on top, I now have a 3-octave spread pattern, and it's also evenly distributed. If I go back to normal distribution one last time, uneven rhythm, even distribution, simple programming via MIDI across as many octaves as you want, up to 10, and that even distribution for nicer automatic note detection and arpeggios from various bits of LFOs and modulation. So not content with Dail being a highly flexible quantizer, Dail is also a precision adder. And we'll start by looking at the onboard transposition, which is a nice performable, quantized, almost whole secondary quantizer. Going into programming mode, we've used the slider and buttons to input notes. With the bottom button for quantizing, you can use the top button to go in and select notes for transposition. Let's add some more notes, and we'll slide up to an E flat, top button, not the bottom, an F and a G. And we can see now we have other available notes, not the quantized notes, but a slightly cut down version for precision adding. So we'll go up or down through these in order. You can keep going up in the octaves. And again, double pressing will cancel this back out, back to its bass tuning. You can still play with Slew in this mode. We can go down instead. So that's using the programming mode and the top button to select the note to transpose with, all the way to the right, and then up and down through your available notes for transposing like a precision adder, adding this to the quantizer. So as well as having the whole right side switch transposition mode for onboard shifting through scales and transposing through them, you have an analog precision adder. Now my patch here, if I remove this, is some randomly wavefolding, randomly sequenced TSL into the Pony VCF using the filter and VCA a bit like a low pass gate. And this is an unquantized, randomly moving sequence into the quantizer, quantizing to a minor scale and coming into my oscillator. As a secondary voice, not going through Dail, I have a rich oscillator filter combo into a bit of delay, and playing them together. Works really well. But muting this secondary voice, if I add in the transposition, or rather the precision adder, and this is analog, it doesn't go into the quantizing, it doesn't merge into this, it literally passes through precisely whatever analog voltage you put in. And this is a quantized sequence already out of my eloquencer, so patching this in. Even though it's a random sequence, hopefully you can hear it moving through this pattern. Now if you wanted to quantize this, if this was an unquantized source, I'd simply mix what was going to be the CV input in a utility mixer with the thing you want to transpose it with to merge these two things, and then go into the CV input. Bringing in the secondary voice again. And so as a final bonus thing, Dail can also be used as a MIDI to CV module. We've been using MIDI through the expander that's to the outside of the screen here, with a USB MIDI keyboard to select notes to quantize to throughout the whole video. However, in the mid-switch position, if we hold down these two buttons for 2 seconds, the lights disappear and this becomes a MIDI to CV. As I play my keyboard, the CV out is the pitch as you'd expect, a trigger is the trigger for every single note, and the gate out is there for that MIDI if you're playing legato style, and you can patch that around ADSRs and use the trigger as a re-trigger if you like. Bringing in my arpeggiator, we can still add slew. And to get back into the normal quantizer mode, press those buttons for 2 seconds again, and then you can use the keyboard. I'll just hold down a shape here to set the available quantizing notes again. And one last time, hold the buttons for 2 seconds, lights disappear, this is now MIDI to CV, slew on the slider, let's arpeggiate one more time.
So if you've got this far in the video, drop a hard sync in the comments. How are you using quantizers? Did you gain some tips and tricks from this video? Do you have some tips and tricks you'd like to share? Leave them down below so we can all discuss and learn from each other. Head over to patreon.com/DivKid to support the work that I do. Hit like and subscribe, that all helps out the channel, and I'll see you next time. Bye.